I have to tell you, when I moved here from Ohio, I thought you could just plant a tomato like you could back in Ohio. You get the nice warm nights, right? You get a red tomato in July, August, something like that. Oh, it's been such a quest, and I am always on the quest for red tomatoes. And I'm assuming all of you are too, whether you're from here or whether you're a transplant from somewhere else. We do have a lot of challenges. Our summers are late to start. It doesn't really, summer, they told me when I moved out here 10 years ago that summer started on the 4th of July, maybe the 5th. I didn't believe them. It's true. I guess if you've been out here, you know that. We have and it's over pretty quick in the fall. Come the middle of October, we're done. And we have a very short growing season because of that. And when we first moved here, we lived at 1,500 feet, and we're down at 1,000 now. So our growing season is even shorter. Anybody that lives above, I think about 800 feet, you know what I'm talking about. So what we're going to be talking about is how to choose the tomatoes that'll work for you, how and when to get started, methods for getting a jump start on the season, feeding your tomatoes, and finally, what you can do at the end of the season to make sure that your tomatoes are red, that you can bring red tomatoes into your house. So the first thing you want to do is look at the label. If you're buying seeds, that's one thing, but you should look up the variety that you're buying too and see what you can get. The first thing that you need to see out here in the Pacific Northwest is the time to maturity. And this one says days to maturity, 75. Now, what that means is from the day that you transplant it, and not the day that if you started seeds in your house, it's not that day. It's the day you actually put it in your garden. It should be about 75 days, given decent weather. And that you can pretty much count on. Another thing that you might want to look at is disease resistance. You can see that this particular one has really good disease resistance. The next thing that you want to look at is its growth habit, and this is really important. This one is an indeterminate, and we'll be talking about that. This one, once it starts bearing, it'll give you tomatoes until the first frost hits. If it's a determinate, they ripen all at once and then they're done. So we've got the determinate, which is usually, but not always, a bush variety, which usually is good for containers. And they ripen all at once and stop, and there are some really good advantages to that. And then the indeterminate that just keep going. But they need to be staked because they can get really, really tall. And sometimes you need to take their height into your hands and shorten them. And the other thing is what you like, the flavor and texture that you like, and also the particular uses that you might have for them. So let's start with the first one. Great tomatoes for higher elevations. You see that days to maturity there? These are ones that we have at our plant sale that are available, assuming they haven't sold out, but we still have a lot available. Days to maturity. So you figure if you plant on the 1st of June, by the middle of July, you could be having red tomatoes if you get one of these earlier ones. And then, you get into 55, 60. Anything over 65 days is considered a mid-season. And where I live, the mid-season is actually late season because our growing season is so short up here. So always take a look at the days to maturity. Again, we're going to really quick look at some tomato terms. If you are interested in saving seeds, you want something that's either open pollinated because it's more or less genetically stable and you don't have to worry too much about saving the seeds. Usually tomatoes are self-fertilizing. They open up before they even are pollinating. They open up and they're already pollinated by the wind. While the flower is still closed up, it pollinates, which is pretty cool. The seeds should breed true, and heirlooms are just open pollinated that have been going on for some time, usually through several, the definition varies, but it can be through several generations of heirlooms or before 1951, and most of those are gone now. Hybrids are specifically engineered to bring out certain qualities in the tomatoes, but they won't breed true because if you have, it's made of a cross between variety A and variety B, you could get anything in between because they're sharing genes, and you could have a red tomato to start with, a yellow tomato that you were, that it was bred with, and you could turn out with something completely different. But they are bred so that they'll have disease resistance, different taste. Perhaps they'll store better, a lot of different qualities. But the seeds won't be like the parent plant, and that's really important to know if you plan on saving seeds. Okay, so this does not want to move for me. Okay, so we've got the beef steaks, which are the really big ones. The slicers, which are smaller, they're usually about, oh, I don't know, 2.5, 3 inches, but you slice them up and they go nice in a salad. Then we all know about the paste ones, the plum aroma tomatoes that make great ketchup and sauces. And they usually don't have as much liquid in them. There's much more flesh. The seeds aren't quite as big or obvious. There's more flesh than there is moisture. And then you've got the cherry tomatoes, which are just amazing if you get good ones. Okay, now we're going to start getting into the good stuff. When you bring home your plants, the first thing you need to do is harden them off because they've been growing in a really, really nice greenhouse atmosphere. So you want to gradually expose them to outdoor conditions for about 7 to 10 days, and that'll help them to slowly acclimate to the outdoors before transplanting. So what you're going to want to do is gradually expose them to cooler environment than the greenhouse with more light and less water. You can harden these kind of vegetables so they can better resist exposure against full sun, wind whipping, dry soil. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with burnt leaves, and possibly they'll just dry out. The foliage will just dry out, and it could die. So definitely acclimate them by hardening them off. If we're expecting something beneath or below 50 degrees, bring them back in at night and then put them back out for lengthening exposures during the day. My cat is in my lap driving me crazy. Get out of here. Okay. So where are you going to plant them? You've got to be in some place where the soil's well drained and fertile, but we'll talk about that later. You've got to have good air circulation, but you don't want it to be on the side of a hill where the wind just comes whipping down and it's too hard on your plants. You want to have it close to where your irrigation is, where your hose is. Otherwise, you're not going to keep your garden watered. And same thing with convenience. The more convenient your garden is to where you live, to where your house is, the more often you'll go out into the garden. And the more often you go out into the garden, the more easily it is for you to see if there are any problems that have occurred from one day to the next. The sooner you get a grip on any problem that shows up, the better you are able to contain it. So again, sight is everything. You want to have at least at the very least 6 hours of sun. More is better. And it's especially for us up here, where it's cold, we need to have it on the south and get the south afternoon sun. And we'll talk about this later too. If you want to help your tomatoes and especially your peppers ripen, get them a little bit extra heat by planting them near something that retains heat during the day. There we go. Okay, so this is an example. This doesn't show up really well here, but it's a foam insulation board that has a reflective material on it, so it's like covered with aluminum foil. It isn't really, but it's reflective. I know some master gardeners who just have their plants out in their garden, but they want to get a little bit of extra warmth and sunlight to their tomatoes and to their peppers, and they'll put this as a backdrop against them, and that helps to reflect the sun's heat, and it helps keep them, it just really increases the amount of sunlight and warmth they get, but it also helps to warm the soil, which we'll talk about later too, and that'll really help increase the growth and the ripening of your plant. And here's some examples of bush variety tomatoes. They can grow really well in those Home Depot buckets. And you see how they've got those against the wall there? The heat goes into the concrete, both places, and gets really warm. And then at night, it retains that heat. So our 50-degree nights aren't 50 degrees where these plants are. I've been able to overwinter annuals we have a little cement pad that's in a corner between our garage and our house. And I put these annual plants out there. I've got snapdragons, and I've got some bacopa and a bunch of other things. Those things live all winter long there because of the reflected heat from the concrete. It's amazing what you can do with a little bit of extra heat here. And at our plant sale, and when you're in a nursery too, they almost always say they will say on the tag if they're good for space for containers, and all of these are. They don't get terribly big. They produce very well, and you can get all kinds. You can get the little cherry tomatoes, you can get sauce tomatoes, and you can get slicing tomatoes, and you can get them at long or short growing days to maturity. So when do you plant? When I was out here, people told me you shouldn't plant until July or June 1st. And I thought, well, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, if you look at the map, it says that we should be able to plant, early May. Well, the problem is the soil temperature should be in the mid-60s to mid-70s. And the only way to check that is to get a thermometer. There are soil thermometers. There are, you can use a meat thermometer. And I can get the soil warm, and I'll show you how to do that, but there's not a whole lot I can do without really working at it to change the air temperature. The best air temperature during the day is 75 to 85, but below 57 at night, and you get delayed growth, and it encourages plant and root disease, which is a real challenge out here. Even in the heat of summer, we get 50-degree nights up here, which is delightful for sleeping, but the tomatoes don't like it. And the peppers like it even less. And something else to note, if you do use concrete or reflective surface behind your plants, after above 85 degrees, pollination doesn't occur. So when we have those really warm spells during the summer where it hits 90 for about 5 days, and about 2 weeks later, you have no tomatoes, new tomatoes coming up, that's probably why. Pollination didn't occur, but once the weather cools down, you'll be in good shape. So what does that mean to us? So if you look, this came from the Weather Service, and by March, let's see, where is this? Here we go. The last 36-degree day, and then the last 32-degree day is usually around mid to late May. However, that's just a rule of thumb. So we don't really go by that. We're not comfortable going by that. So if you delay planting until the first or second week of June, unless you take precautions, you're going to run into trouble. And we're going to be talking about those precautions and how you can extend the growing season so you can get a jump start. And again, it's a combination of the soil coolness and the air being cold at night. So to get a jump start on the season, raised beds or pots are your best bet because the soil in those can warm up faster than the native soil. You can preheat your soil. Now, this is an old photo. This is what they used to say a couple of years ago, use black plastic cloth to heat the soil up, to warm it up about 2 weeks before you plant. But they have found that clear plastic works much better. The only thing that clear plastic doesn't do that the black plastic does, clear plastic warms it up more, but the clear plastic does not stop weeds from growing underneath underneath its cover. So you end up with a little hot greenhouse effect. But if you leave the clear plastic on during some really hot weather, that will kill the weeds, and that will kill the weed seeds as well. So now, how to get a jump start on the season. This is really important. You want to heat the air. That's the most important thing. We just talked about the easy way to heat the ground. Very easy to heat the ground, preheat it. But heating the air can be a little bit more problematic. This is an example of one of the things you can do. I've seen this done. We didn't do it, but you can buy some of that corrugated fiberglass and make yourself a tunnel. It's, you know, it bends really nicely. You can put some rebar or something along the sides to hold it in that shape. And on the really, really cold nights, you can close it up with plastic. But this, usually during the early season, this will give you a good start for keeping your plants warm. We've got some master gardeners in our organization who have something very similar to this, and they're still growing peppers in the garden in October, late October, early November, by using this method. So right here, they're trapping the warm air in there. There are other ways that you can do it. You can place water jugs and bottles inside the structure. My son did something that made sense to me. He has some 2-liter pop bottles, soda bottles, spray painted them black, and puts them out in lays them at the bottom of the plants, the tomato plants and the pepper plants at night. So during the day, they capture the heat from the sun, and at night, they release the heat up to the plant. And just even a couple degrees can really make a difference between a plant having robust growth and just kind of sitting there. And I'll be showing these on the next page, but you can use PVC pipe that you bend over and then just cover it with heavy plastic and hold it in place with clips. That's a little bit more versatile, flexible, because you can lift up the sides and get airflow on those really hot days. And walls of water, that's I'll show you what that looks like. I have one of those, and I've used them with great success. So here's one of the things that I've done. It works very well. I've got one of those clear plastic garbage bags and one of those cheap old tomato cages. And I create a mini greenhouse. Very easy to do, and you can see it's in a black pot right now. That also holds in heat. And on the inside, I don't think I show it, but I've got a milk jug, and the milk jug warms up. It's about half full of water, and the milk jug sits in there, gets warm during the day too, and at night it creates a warm area for the plant, and it's worked really well for me. These are the walls of water I was telling you about. It's a commercial product. And when you buy them, they look like flat, heavy plastic, but you fill each of these little cells with water and you place it around your plant, your little transplant, and that thing will grow like crazy. It's a greenhouse situation for it. The top's open, but at night, the accumulated heat from the day keeps that in a greenhouse condition, a warm greenhouse condition all night long. And it is magic up here. But there are other ways you can do it that doesn't cost so much. This is a cloche, like a little hoop house that you can make very easily. And at the end of this, I've got some resources that'll show you exactly how to do that if you're interested in learning how. So during the cold weather, or during real hot weather, you can roll this up and clip it up here so that you have good air circulation and you don't have to worry about frying your little plants. And this is another thing that you can do, just again with plastic. And somebody here did pretty much the same thing that I did, except they've got more bottles filled with water there. And this is another way. Very easy, very cheap, good way to recycle. This is my favorite method. This is last year's tomato plant. I don't know if I have a picture of what it looked like at the end of the year, but man, it was a monster. But I put the plastic bag down first, then I cut a hole in it. I transplanted my little transplant in there, my little plant start in there. Then I put the tomato cage in there, and then at night I pulled this up over the tomato cage and covered it. And that created a really nice, environment for my plant to get through our cold nights up here. The only problem with any of these, get a jump start on the season is you've got to keep a really close look at the weather that you're having. On a day like today, if you left even the clear plastic ones like this over your plants, they would probably get too hot. So you would have to go out and uncover them. And with the black plastic, of course, you're going to uncover them because they're not getting any light. So let's move on to soil. The best place to start is with a soil test. And I can't see it on my screen, but I'm hoping you can. Underneath this basic soil test and prices is a link to simplysoiltesting.com. There are several other labs that we've used, and this is probably the least expensive and the easiest to understand, and you can get a basic soil test for only $16 plus postage, or you can get one of the others. And I would actually recommend the $32 one, but if all you're interested in is what your pH is and what your major nutrients are, just get the $16 one. You don't need to do this every year, but if you're starting a new garden or you really have no idea where your garden sits right now and things aren't growing well, then I would suggest that you get a soil test. Unfortunately, yes.
Sorry, we can't see it on the screen. So maybe at the end of your presentation, you could put up that website.
Okay, I'll show you. It's in the resources at the end, and I'll show that page. I don't know why this isn't showing. Okay, let me see if I can. No, that's not going to help. I don't know why it's not showing. Okay, thanks, Gary. I will. So it tells you in layman's terms what you need to do. It's like a cookbook. You don't have to guess. You don't have to go out and buy this to do that. It tells you exactly what you need. And even though you're paying money for the test, it saves you money in the long run. And you'll be putting exactly what your plants need, and it's environmentally friendly because you're not going to be getting runoff of the different nutrients, especially phosphorus, which isn't good for our environment. If you have gardens in the past, it's a good idea to rotate the types of crops that you have. If you've got tomatoes and peppers in one area, move them the next year to some place where you had something from a different family, say squashes, cucumbers, and move the squashes and cucumbers to where the tomatoes were, and then, the beans can be part of the rotation too. And the reason for that is a lot of plant diseases are very specific to the crop that you're planting. So the longer you keep your tomatoes in one place, the more chance you have of developing, say, verticillium fungus in the soil, which will kill your tomato plants, but probably won't hurt your others. So rotate once in a while. The other thing, too, is each type of plant that you plant uses different nutrients from the soil, and they can deplete certain nutrients, and it's just a good idea to rotate your crops. Even though if you have a raised bed, you're not really doing much in the way of rotating because you don't have much, space to rotate in. And the big thing that you need to do is to add organic matter to the soil, because that feeds the soil and that will feed your plants. It helps the soil to retain water, and it feeds the organisms in your soil will decompose that organic matter, and the stuff that they create is what feeds your plants. So that's what we're all aiming for. We can add fertilizer, yes, but if you feed the soil, you will feed the plants. These are the most common fertilizers that you see, the nutrients rather. You've got nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And I've heard people say that it's up, down, and all around, but that's kind of debatable because they all work together. There we go. How to do it? If you talk to 6 experts, you're going to get 6 different opinions on how is the best way to fertilize your tomato. They are very heavy feeders, especially for nitrogen, mid-season. Unless you have been adding a lot of organic matter for years to your soil, you will probably need to fertilize it. You'll need to supplement with fertilizer. And there's a lot of people are into organic fertilizers right now, and that's a good thing, except you've got to be very much aware that the organic fertilizers are much slower. They work much more slowly. It takes a lot longer for them to work, so because you're putting stuff into the soil, you're waiting for those decomposing organisms to do their thing, and then it starts to work. And synthetic fertilizers get the nutrition up into the plants immediately, but it can leach out of the soil quickly. So the best bet is to use a granular, slow-release type fertilizer. If you're going to use an organic fertilizer, fertilize the soil right now, before you plant. Right now, 2 weeks before. And here's some suggestions that I got from the University of Idaho for short season growers. This is a really good article and publication, and it's also in the resources. So at planting, you want to place just a handful, 1 to 2 ounces of a complete fertilizer, and these are just some examples of a complete fertilizer. It contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, a little bit more phosphorus than nitrogen or potassium, and put it in a circle around the plant, about 3 inches away from the plant, and then when you water it, it gradually goes into the soil. And what we're talking about there is a commercial fertilizer. And right now, that's all we're talking about is commercial fertilizers. At fruit set, you need to do this again about twice as much as you put in. So it would be like 4 ounces, 4 to 5 ounces in a wider circle around the base of the plant to get down into the roots, and that'll help to sustain production. Now, that little table that you see here gives you some examples of what you would use, and down here is the organic fertilizer. So, and they're saying at planting, but if you're fish emulsion is one thing. If it's a liquid fish emulsion, that will get to your plant right away, but everything else takes a little bit longer to get there. So give it 2 weeks. And then plant your plants. And then it'll be in the soil ready for your plant to go. Let me see if I've got that. More applications of nitrogen or any kind of fertilizer at that point, you probably shouldn't need any more as the season goes on. If you start seeing yellowing leaves that aren't diseased, but yellowing leaves, then you might want to add just a little bit, but not much, because if you add too much, you're going to end up with lots of vegetative or nice green leafy growth, and you're not going to get much in the way of fruits or flowers. So it's a delicate balancing act. One thing you can do to help things along and to give it a boost during the season is to put a shovelful of compost around the plants every other week. That's adding organic matter. It's going to drip into the soil and just gradually keep up a very low level of nutritional supplementation for your plant without giving it that huge boost of nitrogen that'll cause overgrowth of the leaves. Now, you can do that, and this is probably the best way to have total control over it, or you can do this, the easy way. Go out and buy something that's made for vegetable gardens. And I'm sorry that I don't think you'll be able to see the bottom of this sign here of this high yield. This is an example of the instructions on the back of it, but it gives you instructions doesn't give you per plant except for new plants. So it says apply 2 tablespoons for new plants. You can probably comfortably double that when you give it its first feeding during the season, when it first starts to set fruit, when you've got little baby tomatoes about the size of your thumbnail on the plant. That's the next time you want to fertilize, and probably the last time. Okay. Again, feed the soil the easy way, build good soil, and this is the best and easiest way to do that. Go out and get leaves, run them over with your lawnmower a couple times, and put 6 inches of it all over your beds. And you can cover it with a tarp or plastic over the winter time. That'll decompose over the winter in place. It'll compost in place, and come spring, kind of mix it into the top 6 inches of your soil, and you're in good shape. And again, I recommend putting a shovel full of compost around each plant every couple weeks during the growing season. And it might take up to 4 years to build up the soil microbes, so you may not have to add fertilizer to your soil. So here's, if you're over-fertilizing, you're going to see tall and spindly, but not too much flowers. The leaves should be nice and green without any hint of yellowing. And if you see a dark, almost bluish green, excessive growth, that's excess nitrogen. Excess nitrogen also invites aphids to your plants, all garden plants, if you have too much nitrogen, because they love that lush new growth. How to plant. Tomatoes have root system. You can get roots on a tomato all the way up to the first leaves. There are 2 ways to plant it. They should be planted at least 2 feet apart. The more roots you have, the better, more vigorous plant you'll have. You can either plant it deep, which a lot of people really believe in. A lot of people don't have that extra room. But and the other way is trenching. You can plant it horizontally, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But deep seems to work best in my planting bed, because I've got a very, very deep raised bed. And I did a test last year, and this is just my experience. I got better plants that way. So what you do is peel these leaves off and bury that sucker all the way up to about 1 inch below the first set of leaves. And it'll almost kill you to do that, because you started out with this really big plant, right? And you want to cut them off. Don't strip them off, or you expose too much. Yeah, you're damaging the plant. But if you cut them off, they're good. But within a week or 2, you're going to see that plant take off, because it's going to have double the roots. Now, the other way is to lay it on its side, take it out of its pot. Again, remove the lower leaves and dig a trench about 2-3 inches, so that you've got 2-3 inches of soil covering your root system. And you may have to prop it up with another pot or something, just to keep it from laying on the ground at first. But within a couple days, maybe a week, you're going to see the plant just going up to the sun, and it will grow like crazy. Watering, don't overhead water. If you do that, you're opening your plant, or if you're going to, do it early in the morning so the leaves can dry off. Tomatoes have a terrible susceptibility to fungal diseases, and wet leaves just make it a lot easier to spread and for them to get. The recommended amount you're supposed to give them is about 1 inch per week. Preferably water it from the bottom. Water in the morning, water deeply and consistently. Don't let the water dry out. You don't want to water it all the time, but you want to make sure that the water is moist, because have you ever had, do you know what blossom end rot is? I have a picture of it later, but you've got this gorgeous, gorgeous red tomato, and all of a sudden it turns black on the bottom. That's called blossom end rot, and that's due to the fruit not being able to use the calcium that's in the soil, because the soil was too dry for it to take it up. So you've got to keep the soil, and that goes for all plants, but especially tomatoes, peppers, and any kind of squash or cucumber. They can end up with the same problem. You get cracked fruit, blossom end rot. The cracked fruit comes from being very dry, going to very wet, and it takes up too much moisture and it bursts the fruit. You'll see that if you still have tomatoes on the vine in September and we get a real heavy rain, you better pick your tomatoes before that rain hits, or that's what will happen to them when it dries out. The other thing...
Hi, this is Marge. When you say water 1 inch per week, that's
okay.
Spring, not in the dead of not in the deep warm of summer or hot days. Right?
What this means is, for example, if you were to, in your lawn, let's say, this will give you a better idea. In your lawn, if you were to put a tuna can, bury it to the top of it so that the top of it's open and level with the grass, and ran the sprinkler in, you would want that tuna can to fill up to a level of 1 inch. That's how much water it should get. All of your tomatoes should get. You're going to need more, and it's just a rule of thumb, and I don't find it very useful myself. and I'll show you why.
Okay.
Yeah, the plants use it in various amounts during the season. During the year, these little bitty plants aren't going to need an inch of water per week. They're not using an inch of water per week. But in the really hot weather, they're probably going to use more than an inch. And mulching will help to retain the moisture. And I'm going to talk about this first, and then we'll go into the soil moisture. But why would you mulch? It keeps the soils from losing heat and from getting too hot. It helps to maintain what you did put into the soil so that it won't dry out, and it reduces the weed competition. And what kind of mulch? In early spring, like we talked earlier, to warm up the soil, clear plastic is best. And if you can use a black mulch around your tomatoes during the season, what you would do is lay out the black plastic over your beds, make X cuts in it, and plant your transplants in it. And now this is assuming that you're using drip irrigation. The drip irrigation would run underneath your black plastic. And then you plant your little transplant in it, and it warms the soil. It reflects the warmth back up to the plant during the night, and it helps to keep your plant warm during our cold nights. However, organic mulch builds soil. So it's a question of what you want to do. You can add, let's see, what did I put here? If you're going to use organic mulch, say something compost from your compost heap, or the compost that they told you put a shovel full of compost around. Obviously, it should be a dark compost because you want that to absorb the heat. And some university sources recommend using incompletely composted organic matter under the plants because it's still cooking, but you don't want that anywhere near the actual plant tissue because it's not good for it. But that uncomposted or partially composted organic matter will release heat. There's something that I had never heard about before, and I bought some of this stuff. This is a red film. Researchers at the USDA and Clemson University saw that certain crops perform better when grown in red mulch, and this is considered mulch, as opposed to black mulch. Tomatoes yield 20% more fruit, and they had better taste, better weight, and much bigger harvest. And Penn State researchers found that yield increases for tomatoes and eggplants with red mulch was much better. So I'm going to try this. I mean, what can it hurt, right? I'll do it on a couple tomato plants and use my usual on the others. Okay, let's get back to the watering. So, rule of thumb, again, is 1 inch a week. Not very helpful to my mind. What you need to do to check your soil, or to see how moist your soil is, dig down about 6 inches or 4 inches, maybe to the first knuckle on your index finger, around the tomato plant. If it's moist, or if it's soggy, it's overwatered. If it's really dry down there and you can't feel any moisture at all, 6 inches down, 4 to 6 inches down, water more. Your soil at 4 to 6 inches should feel like a mostly wrung out sponge. And that way you know that your tomato plant, or any of your vegetable plants for that matter, are getting the kind of moisture that they need that will help them to grow and that will help them to avoid blossom end rot. And that's really important. Now, we're going to get into the specific things that will help you. Oh, man, I'm running late, but I'll try to get through this part. Should you prune your tomato plants? Yeah, you should, if it's an indeterminate plant. Now, remember, the indeterminate plants are the ones that produce all season long. The determinate plants are the bush ones that produce all at once, and they must be treated differently. So the benefits are, if you prune some of the leaves off, it helps your plant to focus energy on the fruit. You get bigger fruit, you get better air circulation so that you get less disease, possibility of disease on the plant. It's easier to support your plant. It's a lot easier to dig in there and get your hands in and get your fruit without pulling off leaves. And here's the big thing. You get earlier maturity and a higher early yield. Very important for us up here. So the first thing that you want to do, and you can do this with both determinate and indeterminate, get the leaves off the bottom where they're touching the ground. If you don't, there's a good chance that your plant will pick up some kind of a fungal disease. You do not want any of those leaves touching the ground. Pruning tomatoes for indeterminate plants, the vine tomatoes, the ones that are really big, should start at planting time. You should remove all those lower stems that are going to come in contact with the soil. Most of the time, a single pruning of just the suckers that when they're little, 2 to 4 inches long, is usually adequate. But in some years, you might have to take a little bit more off. A second pruning might be necessary to get suckers off the, there we go, off the bottom again. Now, there are 2 different ways to prune. You can prune heavy or prune light on indeterminate plants. These, oh, doggone it, my cat just walked on the keyboard. Sorry about that. These are the suckers right here. So if you're going to do it very heavy pruning, you would take every single one of those out, but leave the one here underneath that first flower cluster, because if you take that off, it's really hard on the plant, and you may end up hurting the plant. I personally don't go this far, but I will do a partial pruning. And as the season goes on, these may grow to be huge arms. You may want to take those off, but if you see that happening, try to do it before they get too big. Let's see. If you remove too much foliage, there's a chance that your tomatoes can get sun scald. You want to balance between enough foliage to feed the plant and a less amount of foliage so that the plant puts its energies into ripening your fruit. So it is a balancing act, and you'll have to pay attention. Now, if you've got a determinate bush plant, one of those that ripens all at once, because you like to do your canning all at once and you want all your tomatoes, and you've got, containers of them, and you've got to be really careful. You can get these off, these lower ones, so they're not touching the ground, but don't trim anything off from there on up, because the suckers that come out on these plants also bear fruit, and they only do it once. If you chop those off, they will not come back. So if you're buying one of the bush tomatoes, be aware of that one, that if it says it's determinate, don't trim anything else than the ones underneath that first blossom, and then don't prune ever again during the season. And there's what a sucker looks like. It's in the armpit of the tomato plant. And remove all the foliage from about 1 foot from the ground when the tomatoes are pretty small, or when spots appear on the lower leaves. And I don't do this. Some people say that you should on indeterminate tomatoes, is to remove all the flowers. Like if you bought some tomatoes at our plant sale and they've got flowers, they would tell you to pinch those off to give the plant the extra energy to put out good roots, and then keep all the tomato flowers on them so that they can produce fruit. When the tomato plant gets too tall, on the indeterminate, the tall vining tomatoes, you can remove the terminal shoot, and that should help to curb the height. You could also get a little bit more vigorous about it and chop it off right about here when it reaches the height that you can no longer manage it, or if it reaches the top of your trellis or your staking system. Now, we're getting into the specific things about getting your plants ready to give you red tomatoes. On September 1st is when you want to stop the growth. This is a little bit out of order, but let's talk about this pretty quickly. Watch for the tomato problems. You've got to keep everything up off the ground. Get any fallen leaves up. That's really important. And if you see any spots forming on your leaves, usually your lower leaves, get them off, because that could be either probably early blight. And it's a fungus, and you want to get those leaves off your plant so that they don't spread. Or it could be, there are other leaf spot diseases, but just get them off. If you see them occur, get them off immediately. This means that you're out in your garden every morning with coffee, taking care of any problems that you see. So if you're looking for leaf curling, you see that often this time of year because the nights are cold and the plant is stressed. Any stress, you can find leaf curling on a plant. Too much water, not enough water, too much heat, too much cold. But you can get blossom end rot, like I said, from not having consistently moist soil. We have enough calcium in our soil here, but if you're unsure about that, get a soil test. And don't use Epsom salts. Don't use Epsom salts. Everybody will tell you, use Epsom salts. That doesn't help. That puts magnesium in the soil. When you put magnesium in the soil, if the soil doesn't need it, it's throwing your whole chemical equation out of balance and makes it so that your plant can't use the other nutrients it needs. Stay away from Epsom salts unless the soil test tells you you need it. Okay, pests. This is what you see when a stink bug is on your plant. If you find them, get out and squish them. Flea beetles will make little holes like this in your plant. Aphids, of course, look like this on the back of the leaves, and you can have slug problems. Get on top of it. Don't let it get ahead of you. If you do that, you'll have a much better chance of taking care of any problems. I would suggest that you don't use insect spray at all in your garden if you can help it. If you're out there every day, you can stop it before it gets bad. If you do end up using a spray, please call us at the Plant and Insect Clinic and we'll explain to you how to use the least toxic method so you're not killing all the beneficials. And we'll also tell you how to use it so that you're not hurting the pollinators. And if you do have a problem, you want to just spot spray the problem area and don't spray everything indiscriminately, or you're killing all the good guys that would eventually be able to take care of all the pests in your garden. Some more diseases. This is late blight. We don't usually have too much of a problem with that unless we get rain. Verticillium wilt frequently comes from planting the same plant in the same place, and the whole plant dies really fast. On the labels, make sure you get something that says verticillium resistant and clean up all of that stuff and destroy it. Don't compost it. Stick it in black plastic bags and put it out for the trash. Okay. Any fruit that hasn't ripened by the end of August is not going to ripen, and it's going to kill you to do this, but get off all the baby fruits off your plant. Cut them off. If you've got some that are ready to go, that are, of a reasonable size, and you think they'd be the size that would ripen, keep those, cut everything else off. And stop the plant growth by topping it. Cut back to a reasonable size, get all the baby tomatoes off of there. It will hurt to do this. Cut off all the blossoms that are left on that plant. Again, they're not going to ripen. Get rid of them. Cut them all back to the first node. The first node being where the leaves attach next to the blossoms. Remove most of the leaves, not all of them, but most of them, and make sure that you leave enough leaves to cover the tomatoes that are there so that they won't get sun scald. They need a little bit of shade. Start from the bottom up when you remove the leaves. But like I said, in very hot weather, keep some shade for them. This better circulation helps to prevent that late blight that we just saw on the previous slide. This makes the plant focus its energies on ripening your fruit, not in producing new fruit or producing new vegetative growth. Water, but don't let the plants wilt. Keep an eye out for any chance of blossom end rot. If you do that finger in the soil thing and you feel it moist down 6 inches, you're doing it right. You don't want to feel the soil, probably even dampen those first 6 inches at this point in the game. Now, that's ripening it on the vine. Ripening them off the vine, you can pull them off if you're expecting a frost and get them off. And I like to put them in boxes of relative ripeness. And you want to get the tomatoes that are just starting to get that kind of whitish blush to them. Says that, yeah, I would, if the season were long enough, I would ripen for you, yes. So you pull them off, leave the stem things on. Don't pull that stem out of the blossom end, or the stem end out, because that opens it up to disease. I would not have saved this one here because it's got cracks and it is going to get some kind of some disease, and it's going to spread it to everything else. It should be a very nice tomato. Wipe it off, take a look at it, and put it in boxes of relative ripeness. These will ripen really fast. This will be a little bit later, and this will probably ripen at the end of October. And it should be about 70 degrees, and you can expect to have good fruit in about 14 days if you've got the almost ripe ones, and then you can expect the green ones to last a little bit longer. I grew Brad's Atomic tomatoes last year, and they were, I don't know what I was thinking, they've kind of got a long days to maturity date for my area. But it got to the point where I couldn't leave them on the vine anymore. I took off whole branches and brought them into our garage. And we had Brad's Atomic tomatoes that tasted absolutely amazing on Christmas Day. So there are ways to get good tomatoes late in the season, even up where I live. At the end of the season, you're going to want to remove all of the tomato plant. Don't leave anything in it because that just can encourage disease. Add the 6 inches of organic matter like chopped up leaves to your soil and cover it with a tarp. And we are here for you. You can either email Gary at the email address he gave you, garyf@wsu.edu, or you can do Cowlitz Pastor Gardener, or our phone number, and we'll help you out during the season any time of the year. We've got the answers. If we don't know, we can find the answers. So on our website, Gary will have that information. I'm going to have this whole slideshow will be there. The video tomorrow, the next day, when Gary gets it to me, will be up there, and you'll also be able to get to these handouts. The soil testing that I was talking about that you couldn't see before is right here. simplysoiltesting.com. All the instructions are there. So, are there any questions?